Welcome to the Punishment in Society Digital Speaker Series. Punishment in Society is a collaborative research network, or CRN, of the Law and Society Association. You can find past DSS talks on our website. Today, we hear from Chrysanthi Leone, she, her, an associate professor of sociology and criminal justice at the University of Delaware, and Maggie Buckridge, she, her, an undergraduate student at the University of Delaware, studying criminal justice, BA, and women and gender studies, BA, with a concentration in domestic violence prevention and services. They will be discussing I'm Scared to Death to Try It on My Own, using iPoems to capture the complexities of religious support for people on the US Sex Offender Registry. At the end of the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A. You can put your question or name in the chat at any time to get a queue going, or you can raise your virtual hand during the Q&A portion at the end of the talk. As a reminder, we are recording this session, so if you do not want to be on camera, please feel free to post your question in the chat and I can read it for you. Before I turn it over to Chrysanthi and Maggie, I want to announce that our next installment of the Digital Speaker Series will feature Andrew Jefferson from the Danish Institute Against Torture presenting in January. With that, I turn it over to you, Chrysanthi and Maggie.
Great. Thank you so much. You'll see that I dropped in the chat the link that goes directly to our Google Slides. So if it's helpful for you to look at it that way, you're welcome to do so. It would also be lovely if you could drop in the chat your name, if you want to just do your first name and the pronunciation, that would be wonderful. And then if you feel like it, share with us the last time that you read or listened to a poem. So then I will share my screen and we will get going. All right, is that working? Are you seeing just what you're supposed to be seeing? Yeah, Jess is nodding for me. All right, cool. All right, so we changed the title a little bit. What Ashley read to you is still accurate, but what I really wanted to emphasize is that we're going to focus on the iPoem aspect today, more so than findings from our study. So there's going to be a little bit of findings sprinkled in, but primarily we're going to focus on using iPoems and how that process has worked for us over a number of different projects and venues in terms of recognizing agency and working to destigmatize folks. So a couple of caveats and some other things, but first I do want to say how really excited I am to be here. I have not been able to join these live, although I have watched some of them, and I really appreciate Ashley's leadership, both in the CRN overall and in setting up this. It's just been lovely to work with her, so that's pretty cool. All right, I'm going to forget which thing I am advancing. So there we go, got to the next one. So the caveats that I would like to share, I'm recovering from throat surgery, so I'm still, sometimes my voice goes out. I'm also a little foggy in the brain. I know many of us have that from our COVID times and being online a lot. So I'm nervous. I'm excited, but I'm also nervous because I haven't given a talk since I had surgery. And so, you know, I'm nervous. That's one of my caveats. My next caveat is that this is not a research talk. This is more of a pedagogy / research talk. And it comes from the fact that, as many of you may feel, what we study and talk about and research and teach is often really a bummer. It's dark stuff. At least in my experience, I need to pepper my life with fun in order to bring the energy that I want to bring to my work. And so one of the things that I've explored over the years is providing creative access points into the material. So moving away, you know, as most of us have done, moving away from the traditional kinds of readings that we probably got in graduate school and other kinds of mixed media, but also in terms of how we actually engage in class with materials. And so engaging through poetry is one of those more fun things. And then Maggie will be talking, my co-author will be talking later about the kinds of campus events and things that we've done along with that as well. Another important caveat is that we want to be clear that our use of iPoems is one way that we are attempting to recognize the mediation that researchers have on participants' experience in the research. So we know it's imperfect. We still have a mediating effect. You're not hearing directly from participants the way you would in a sort of casual conversation or otherwise, but we think iPoems are a step towards helpful kinds of mediation. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So by no means are we giving voice to people, right? That is definitely not what we're doing here. We are providing different ways of accessing the research materials that we've created and prepared, because I found in my teaching that often presents a way for people to listen that they would not otherwise. And part of that came from how impressed I have been with work that other Law and Society scholars have done. And I particularly want to shout out Laura Beth Nielsen and her excellent book, Rights on Trial, because it includes on the publisher's website links to the audio. So as you're reading the book, you can then go to the website and hear the people saying what they have quoted from in the book. I just love that. So we have permission from some of the participants in one of our studies to have that audio be shared. And down the road, we hope to do something similar to what Laura Beth has done there. All right. We try to use person-first language. That's my last caveat. It's cumbersome and onerous. So the bulk of the research that we're drawing from today comes from work that I've been doing over the last, I would say, 20 years on people who have been convicted of sex offenses, and typically people whose conviction has led them to be on the sex offender registry in the United States. It's much easier to just say sex offenders, but for ideological and a number of other reasons, we don't do that. So we say people who've been convicted, people on the registry. Sometimes we'll say registrants if we really need to shorten it. Happy to talk more about that in the Q&A, but I just wanted to make it clear that we know it's a little cumbersome, but we think it's important. So overall, the purpose that we're going to focus on today is how we can use different methods of sharing our research that are part of our overall purpose that recognizes the agency of people who are often denied that agency through our criminal legal system and other aspects. People who are often stigmatized. By offering differently mediated ways to hear from them, we think that helps erode some of that stigma. So we'll talk a little bit about the ongoing project that we're working on now, but primarily we're going to be focusing on iPoetry and how we work that. All right, so this is some of the work that informs where we are today. Some of it is with my colleague, Maggie Buckridge, who you'll be hearing from in a minute. I'm also really delighted to welcome a new colleague who's joining our research group, Jess, and you'll be hearing her read one of the poems that she crafted later on today. I also collaborate often with Corey Stema, hey Jess, and Ashley Kilmer. And so you'll see a number of different pieces that we've worked on together. At the bottom of the screen is the iPoem project. It's just a website where we list some of the things that we're working through. I think only one of the poems we're going to talk about today actually appears there, but we're happy to send you any of those articles. All right, and from here, I'm going to pass it to Maggie.
Hello, we are going to start with an iPoem. So Clark Kent chose his own pseudonym. He went creative. He is a United Methodist Church pastor as well as a parent. The poem features a dialogue between him and his kids and another person who was sort of involved in this short little story that he told us during our interview. This was actually one of the first interviews we conducted as part of this project. It's actually the first interview I ever conducted, so it's a fitting poem to start. I was loading the minivan. I opened the doors, with my little remote. I'm like, okay, guys, go buckle up. And they're like, there's someone in the van. Can I help you? I thought you might be going somewhere. Maybe you can give me a ride. I'm like, get the fuck out of my car. Like, what are you doing? I used the words I'm not supposed to use. I was like, angry. I'm a clergy person. I'm the religious leader. I am a doormat. I'm supposed to kind of just like clay on the potter's wheel, fix it. I don't know where she ended up. So that was our first poem. Again, a dialogue between Clark Kent, his kid, and this woman who he just found in his minivan one morning. So as we've discussed, iPoems are a way in, they're an entry point into some topics that are otherwise sometimes hard to discuss or hard for people to initially grasp. So iPoems are also a type of found poetry and a method of qualitative research analysis. Creating found poetry involves selecting words directly from an existing text to create a poem. The original text can be an interview or focus group transcript, written court proceedings, oral archive transcripts, or even news articles or short stories. iPoems, as we've discussed, allows researchers to decenter themselves, but we do give the caveat that, of course, a researcher cannot entirely remove their impact from the work that they're doing when they're creating an iPoem. It's the researcher who makes decisions about what lines to include and when to make certain edits for clarity or flow, when to maybe switch the order of a line in order to help the chronological narrative make sense to listeners. And lastly, poetry, especially poetry, highlights how participants speak about themselves and their own experiences. So as Chrysanthi said, we're not giving voice to people, but instead we're sort of conveying their own voice in an interesting way and in a more creative way. So I poems are an accessible and beautiful way to convey someone's voice. I statements, including I'm, I've, I, are pulled directly from interview or focus group transcripts. And then each line of an I poem begins with an I statement. We've also played with this format a little bit and explored we poems as well as you poems. I'm going to talk about we poems today. They play with the I poem format in that instead of pulling I statements, you pull we statements. These are really good at capturing shared experiences as well as collaborative meaning making that happens in focus groups. So some of the interviews that we've conducted as part of this study have included some people who want to be interviewed together. We've interviewed a few husband and wife pairs, as well as some colleagues who just want to be interviewed together because they do the work together. And then later we'll hear a we poem from Jess that she actually wrote recently this year.
Great. And so as I posted in the chat, this will be a lot more fun if it's not just us reading the poems. So you have the link. Please feel free to take a look. And if there's one that you would like to help us out by reading, we would appreciate it. It would be helpful in moving us along. And so we're hearing a variety of voices. So the next kind of explanation or bit of context we want to offer is that the current research that we're working on, and I'll talk more about the parameters of the research in a bit, focus on how people provide support for people on the sex offender registry. So what we're talking about here are not people who do it as part of their job with the state, right? So we're not talking about probation and parole officers or even caseworkers or social workers. Instead, we're talking about people often who work in nonprofits or other religious institutions. And so they are much less studied and therefore much less, people are less aware of what they're doing, how they use their discretion, features along these lines. And that's important. Oops, did I go to the right one? Let's see. Nope, I skipped ahead. Thank you. Okay. No, I did. Okay. I'm using multiple computers and I thought I had it all down, but there are a few little bumps, as there always are. So the reason that I decided to look in this direction, I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of the research and teaching I do is a bummer. And nonetheless, my undergrads, particularly the ones who stick with our major in criminal justice especially, really do want to make a difference in their professional and often in their volunteer engagement. And so I'd like to give them advice about how they can create careers that will be meaningful, that will allow them to persist. That I don't want to churn out people who are going to 5-10 years into it feel bad about the work they're doing. And I know that's not my responsibility, but the degree to which I can be helpful, I think, is an important part of what I want to do. So there's a practical reason here that we focus on reentry supporters. People don't really know about them, and they don't understand that that's a possibility. And even more importantly, we want people who do this work to be knowledgeable, compassionate, and humane. And by this work, I mean people working with people in the sex offender registry specifically, but also people who work in other kinds of areas that are around the criminal legal system. And this is important because of how we know the amount of power they hold over the vulnerable. And we also know that unrealistic expectations lead to dissatisfaction. And we know that people who do work that is a bummer are vulnerable to burnout, right? And especially something that I have found in my work is the secondary stigma that is attached to people who do work that supports stigmatized groups, including those on the registry. So in terms of sort of the literature kind of context, folks here are probably familiar with the work of Lipsky on street-level bureaucrats, the idea that the folks who have these street-level on-the-ground roles have a great deal of power and discretion. I've also been paying more attention to the kinds of role conflicts that they experience. The work of some of the graduate students who've gone through our department in recent years have really focused on the kinds of justice dissonance that is created by being tasked with one thing and then being told from above that you have to do something else. Happy to talk more about that. Maggie will be talking in a few minutes a little bit more about burnout and vicarious trauma, which is interestingly, it was Maggie who introduced this to me. Trauma Stewardship is an outstanding book, which I highly recommend. And it is written by the Lipsky that we all know, street level bureaucrats, his daughter. So I think that that is deeply informed by the Law and Society work with which I was more familiar. I see less around trauma, at least not in my graduate education or my formative exposure to Law and Society. So I think it's kind of fun to bring those together. And then lastly, I want to draw attention to the work, especially emerged in the last 3 or 4 years, that looks at the significance for people who are reentering society, not specifically people in the registry, but people reentering generally, in having someone in their lives that helps them foster their spiritual resilience. So there's research that shows that God talk and persistence can really help the people who are reentering. And so we wonder, does this mean there's a role for that kind of sense of purpose related to religious or spiritual motivation that might be helpful for supporters? And I realize, Maggie, I just stole some of what you were going to say in your slide. I apologize about that. That's how it goes sometimes. All right, we are up now to giving fewer fucks. Is that right?
Yes, and I see Ashley Rubin has volunteered to read this poem.
Yay, that's great.
Yeah, and we can all give her a few snaps afterwards or use the reactions button to do some clapping or whatever we feel after she is finished reading.
Awesome. Okay. So Giving Fewer Fucks by Reverend Brian, a UMC pastor. Enough people are dead. I was in this position, I think. I was more willing to put up with, especially locally elected officials' crap. I was fearful that I would somehow cut the relationship off. If I was like too forward, telling them that homeless people are dying, I wish I had, and you'll have to forgive the language here, but like 2019 was my year of giving fewer fucks. I was like, no more of this. I'm not gonna. I don't want to play this anymore. If the relationship is done, you don't want to talk to me anymore. Fine, enough people are dead. I wish I had started that a little earlier.
Thank you. So that is what it looks like if anybody else wants to volunteer. The document is still in the chat if you just want to put your name next to a slide that you're interested in reading a poem for. So I'm going to talk about burnout and vicarious trauma. So burnout is an occupational phenomenon characterized by a response to chronic stressors on the job. This can be experienced regardless of the field, regardless of how often you interact with other people experiencing trauma. Burnout is just basically the response to being overworked and under-resourced. Vicarious trauma is an occupational challenge for people working and volunteering in the fields of victim services, law enforcement, and other professions due to their continuous exposure to victims of trauma and violence. This is also referred to as secondary trauma. You might have heard the term compassion fatigue as well, which is related. I'll also note that though we're focusing on people who are doing this work as a profession or as part of their volunteering commitments, these terms also apply to people who are caregivers of people who are experiencing trauma or of elderly parents who might need help caring for themselves and those types of things. So in their book, Trauma Stewardship, Lipsky and Berg write about the impact of trauma exposure in a more broad way. So they don't just focus on people doing more government-based work like victim services and law enforcement, but they write about the impact of trauma exposure for anyone who interacts with the suffering, pain, and crises of others or our planet. So they take a really holistic approach to looking at trauma exposures. These responses can include feelings of helplessness, a sense that somebody can never do enough, hypervigilance, fear, dissociative moments, anger, cynicism, avoidance of work, amongst a bunch of other sort of factors and risk factors. So you'll see throughout the poems that some of these themes of vicarious trauma and some of the sort of symptoms or signs of a trauma exposure response are evident throughout the poems. As Chrysanthi was talking about earlier, another theme that's come up is God talk and persistence. So people who work in challenging fields like reentry sometimes are grounded in their personal faith, and that grounding has been associated with longer-term persistence in this emotionally draining and often under-resourced work. So we've interviewed many folks who work at religious ministries and who share their personal faith with their program's clients or residents if it's a housing program. As we discussed, Lori Banfield talks about how many reentering people benefit from this spiritual resilience practice, and we think that that might also hold true for people who are doing this reentry work, not just people who are reentering themselves. And faith can be an important component of reflection, finding purpose and meaning making for many people in a variety of helping professionals, especially people working in the field of reentry. And scholars have argued that this reflection is sort of a protective factor against vicarious trauma and more severe trauma exposure responses. But then there's a flip side. On the other hand, people who describe their work as a calling, whether it's spiritual, faith-based or not, can be more vulnerable to vicarious trauma and burnout for other reasons. They might be especially vulnerable to that feeling that they're never doing enough. And they might be especially vulnerable to a feeling that they cannot stop, that they can't transition out of this work, that they can't do something a little more uplifting that's still helping people, but maybe isn't as under-resourced or as emotionally draining or as tied to violence and trauma, because they feel like this is their purpose. They feel like this is God's purpose for them and that this is what they're here for. This is their calling. So they kind of just have to put up with the trauma and put up with the violence that they're witnessing and the way that it's starting to impact their own well-being because it's what they're meant to be doing. So we've reached another poem. Let me see. We don't have any volunteers on the Google document, but if anybody would like to volunteer, you can also do so out loud. If not, I will read this poem. But I'd love to have a reader if anyone's interested. Okay, I'll read this one. So this is Robert Falconer. So he's the founder of an independent religious ministry that houses not exclusively people who are on the registry, but a lot of people who are on the registry. I grew up homeless at times, inner city, drugs, everything. I was young. I was separated from my family. I haven't seen my brothers and sisters, except one, since I was 18. I lived nomadically. I never knew anybody for more than 3 years. I moved from city to city. I would end up homeless. I understand what it's like to be completely alone, not having anyone to call. I believe Christ changed my life. I was invited up to the prison with another organization. I was there. I ran into the warden, and he asked me if we could use the beds for the guys in prison. I said, sure. I then ended up interviewing over 30 people. I had no idea what to do. I didn't know anything about the prison system. Anything. I went back that night. I got on my knees and I prayed. And I cried. And I said, Lord, I have no idea who to take out of prison. I'm clueless. I don't know how to go about this. I went back the next day and said, we'll take anybody that doesn't have any other place to go. So anybody that can go to a pre-release, anybody that has family that they can go to, all that, I eliminated them. I had absolutely no idea at the time that that would mean we'd be primarily taking long-term violent offenders and sex offenders.
Thanks for reading that one, Maggie. So the current project in which we're looking at people who either as their main job professionally or as one of their primary roles within sort of a number of other things that they are doing for their work as reentry supporters. This grew from a previous study that I did with my colleague, Ashley Kilmer, which Maggie has also been helping us continue to analyze. It's a pretty rich data set. And for that one, we talked to people who were, am I on the right one? I am, I'm just, I should have gone right into the poem. Okay, sorry, I got my order out of the way. But since I'm there, I think I'm gonna reverse these and talk about these next. Yeah, okay. So the previous work that informed this looked at family members who were doing the work of reentry. So it grows from the work of Megan Comfort, which I would hope many of you here are familiar with. And we will talk a little bit more kind of about the specifics around those issues in a moment. But Maggie, do we have another volunteer or should I read this one?
Let me check. We don't have another volunteer, so you can read
Okay,
this.
so I will read this one. I'm going to try clicking over to the poem. It may throw off the screen sharing. Yeah, it does. Sorry about that. But I think that's the way to go for now. And then I will click back in a moment. All right, so this is from Jessa, a family member who was part of that original data set that we'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. And Justice says, I never speak to them about it. I mean, friends have worked out okay for me. People I've met along the way. I have more constructive conversations with. I've selected them carefully. I found out about my partner's offense. I knew I would need to talk to my friends about the offense itself. I talked to those friends about policies. I've been afraid to get involved. I have felt that I'm already just trying to protect my little family. I've been afraid to be seen. I went to a meeting once. I don't need another therapy group. I didn't come back. I kind of felt a little bit like some people there really needed treatment. I will avoid telling anyone my partner's last name. I just sort of try to keep the whole thing on the down low. I've had a bad experience with my family finding out. I told them I was dating someone and made the mistake of telling them his first name. I mean, it utterly changed my relationship with my family. I mean, I was afraid. I don't know who we can trust. I don't know how anyone is going to react. I mean, I think people look at him because he's just so beautiful. I can't remember now how many places we applied for. I mean, we don't have a lot of money. I have a security pension. I had a great credit score. The most I could ever get out of people was, you don't meet our rental criteria. Everyone I know has found out by looking on the registry. I put quite a lot of energy into this work. I mean, I feel very protective of him. I think I take a lot on, probably more than I should. Removing the registry would remove a huge burden from my life. I don't know. I think, Maggie, you're the next one. Or did I? Yes, okay, good.
Yeah, you're good. So why focus on reentry support specifically for people who are on the registry? Obviously, within the scope of mass incarceration, most people who are incarcerated are not going to be incarcerated for a sex offense. They'll be incarcerated for something else. So all formerly incarcerated people, but for the most part, experience a mix of assistance, surveillance, and unreviewed discretion, especially from probation and parole officers. But this is especially compounded for people who are labeled as sex offenders by post-conviction restrictions. As we've discussed, various street-level bureaucrats, including probation, parole, and staff of nonprofit organizations, have tremendous discretion in determining what that mix and that balance of support and surveillance and policing looks like. A paramount concern for people leaving incarceration, and especially for people on the registry, is finding a place to live. So 33 states and many local jurisdictions have residency restrictions that prohibit people on the registry from living, working, or going to school within a certain distance of a school, park, daycare, or place where children might congregate. So that phrase, where children might congregate, is very broad, deliberately so. And what qualifies as a place where kids congregate depends on the jurisdiction, as well as the discretion of probation and parole officers. But we've heard that this phrase can encompass places like school bus stops for K through 12 schools, other public transportation stops like public bus stops, train stops, as well as even malls and shopping centers where kids, especially teenagers, might be hanging out. So we've heard from folks who can't shop at the mall, for example, because there's going to be kids there, but they might be allowed to shop at another store. Furthermore, public housing authorities and private landlords commonly go beyond the law and bar people convicted of sex offenses or demand a sex offender surcharge. And that's a charge that they basically say, oh, you're on the registry, we're going to charge you an extra $200 a month for rent or whatever, $200 every week or whatever it might be. As we heard in Jess's poem, she said she had a great credit score. She had a pension, but she still wasn't able. It was really hard to find somewhere that would lease to them. So in addition to these state approved barriers, these state laws, there's also private landlords who can prohibit people who are on the registry from living there at their own discretion. Overall, registrants are especially likely to face homelessness after incarceration when compared to other people who are convicted of other offenses and are being released. It's important to note that housing can be especially inaccessible for those who are on the registry who experience multiple oppressions. So research has demonstrated that Black registrants, as well as veterans on the registry, have experienced higher rates of homelessness than when compared to other registrants. We find it interesting, while LGBTQ registrants have not been found to face more housing insecurity or homelessness than straight cis registrants, they are significantly less likely to own property and are, on the flip side, also therefore more likely to be renters, which can expose them to more of that discretion and sort of control of different private landlords. The other important factor is that homeless shelters are often inaccessible due to registry restrictions or organizational policies. So some shelters are not legally allowed to house somebody on the registry because they might be too close to a park, for example. Other homeless shelters, while they may legally be allowed to house somebody on the registry, have organizational policies and have just decided that that's not a population that they want to serve. Another sort of compounded inaccessibility layer is for disabled people who are on the registry. So a recent law review found that in New York City, only 4 shelters are in compliance with residency restrictions and able to shelter registrants. And later, you're going to hear a poem from our interview with Bubba, who is a disabled man on the registry and now is an assistant manager at a homeless shelter / reentry program. Now we're going to hear from Jess reading her poem from an interview with Phil and Claire. They're a married couple and they're both on the registry, and they're both active advocates with the national group as well as the regional group in the state that they live in.
We all deserve a second chance. We focus on people, helping people find jobs, housing, different types of support, trying. One thing we're doing. We're actually starting that this month. We've connected with rebounders. We'll be able to refer people to them. We both have a lot of experience with therapy groups. We know that it has to take a different kind of tone. We hope that it can provide support and stuff, not just for the people on the registry, but the families and stuff. We don't really know the word for it. Just isolating situation. We're not meant to be isolated. We're not meant to be individuals without other individuals in our lives. We all have faults. We've all done something. We've all been somewhere. We're all human. We've all done something bad. We talk about how we're supposed to treat people. We're supposed to forgive and go forward, but that includes, people that we know have hurt us. We know that love and compassion towards people. We're a new creature in Christ. We find that we help people try to be that example, be that voice. We're developing materials to help people understand, how do you actually treat people as a friend? We can come together as an organization. We all have those days where it's like, I can't do this. We've been able to bring each other along when we're struggling in something. We're all here for a reason. We can't change it. We can't change what we do today. We don't have to own what society is serving us. They're serving us bullshit, and we don't have to eat it. We've done it, what we've supposed to have done. We fulfilled our purpose. For those of us who have taken treatment seriously, we owe it to each other to set a good example. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our victims. We owe it to each other. We owe it to society to be a better person. We want to help other people do that. We want to help people see that that's where the past is in the past. We are people and still have a purpose. We are human. We have so much to give.
Thank you, Jess. So Jess crafted that poem as a student in my capstone seminar on the topic of sex crimes and punishments. And it was one of a number of really beautiful poems that students in the class created. So we're really happy Jess could share that with us today, and that Jess is going to join our analytical team going forward. So I, jumped a little bit out of order, as I do when I get enthusiastic. I mentioned earlier that the prior work, that is still not what I meant to move. Geez Louise. Okay. Let me go back up and see where I apologize. I'm gonna have to go quickly through these to find the one I moved. Yeah, I'm trying to do this on 2 different screens and I have done something that didn't quite work.
There you go.
There. All right.
Oh,
Finally got
I'm
it.
back.
Apologies. Yes, I'm where I want to be. So the prior work that I did with my colleague Ashley Kilmer, who's at Towson University, looked at how family members experience what we call secondary registration. We were so excited that that article was accepted in Punishment and Society earlier this year. Happy to send it to you because we're excited about it. And one of the things we found in that piece was, as I mentioned, family members do a lot of the work of reentry for folks. And we know that, as I said, from Megan Comfort's amazing work and from others as well. But what we find is that secondary registration is an even more direct targeting of family members. And they not only feel the stigma and have additional consequences, but they feel a tightness of penal power similar to what Comfort found, but that really extends into the community and including community surveillance and control. And so as we were doing that work, in the interviews, we always ended with, what keeps you going? What sustains you? And for some of the family members who were doing this work and experiencing this very heavy stigma, hardships in terms of losing their homes, all kinds of really terrible experiences as a result of supporting their registrant, we asked what kept them going. And some of them talked about the importance of community, right? That there were people, whether it was advocacy communities that they joined online or religious communities that they found that welcomed them. And so that's sort of what planted the germ for the current work that Maggie and I are working on now, where we're talking to reentry supporters who specifically are part of facilitating that kind of continued involvement in religious communities. And we're hearing from people how painful it is when they're excluded. Right. So one of the people that we've interviewed for the current study, his pseudonym, self-selected pseudonym is Magic, explained one of the first efforts he made to join a community after leaving prison for the time he served for his sex offense. I was talking to the priest after services and he told me to get off the property. The priest came over and told me, and I told him, how come? Because you're a sex offender and you don't belong here, right in front of everybody talking. You know, you can come to church, but you can't hang around. You can't have coffee afterwards or the donuts or fellowship. So as someone who is really interested in how policies are put into practice, as someone who is really interested in ending sexual violence, preventing sexual violence, this brings up a lot of complications, right? We understand why organizations, communities, including religious ones, want to have boundaries and safety policies and plans, but there's a tension there between the other kinds of aspects of their community and their own sort of self-proclaimed inclusiveness that really come to a head when someone who has left prison for a sex offense wants to rejoin the community. And this has come up again and again in conversations that we've had with folks, including those who then go on to form their own religious communities or organizations to allow for some of that sense of community to come through. All right, do we have somebody for Baba?
I think Jess is interested. So I'm going to quickly introduce Bubba. So he is the driver and assistant manager at a reentry ministry. And he told us he was initially a regular resident. So he just left incarceration, went there, just your typical resident participant in this program. But now he provides him with services like driving and other administrative work that has to get done.
Okay. I don't get paid, but I do. I still get the housing. I pay fees like everybody else. Several years ago, I dedicated my life to God and to the ministry. It's saving my life. I was a druggie on the street, so I lost everything. I'm on disability, so that's my pay. I also needed a structured environment in my life. I'm scared to death to actually go out and try it on my own. I can't afford it on disability. I don't get more than $844 a month. That's not much money. I have a truck. I pay my insurance. I'll probably be here for a long time.
So this is one of our last poems. I don't believe we have a volunteer, but again, if anybody wants to just unmute yourself and volunteer now, you can. And I can also put the link in the chat again, if that's helpful for folks.
I can go ahead and do it.
Cool.
The poem is by Ashley, and I am Ashley, so that feels appropriate.
Okay.
So Ashley is a nonprofit organization person, and the title is I Don't See Anyone Else Doing It. I think that, it's easy to kind of look back at things that have happened in your life and jerry-rig it, and to say like, oh, there was a clear path to here. I mean, I'm not brand loyal to my religious organizations. I'm not brand loyal to jobs. I'm not afraid of change. I'm not afraid of following shiny objects. I grew up in a house where where there were both social workers and teachers. I wonder how much of that kind of seeped into my consciousness. I ended up walking into prisons, like that could not have surprised anyone more than me. It was just never something I assumed would happen. I have to feel like, yes, in order for me to have ended up where I was, it was a calling of some sort. I had been, and this may partly be personality, like these or those bleep are not getting me down. I'm gonna keep going. I don't know whether that's me and like a slight bit of vengeance. I'm going to outlive you all because you're unhealthy. I am meant to be doing this. I will find a way to do this. I think maybe it's a healthy mixture of both. I hope it's healthy. I am. I do it. I see the need for it. I am also looking around. I don't see anyone else doing it.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I appreciate that. So we're wrapping up here. So if you have questions, we have a few more slides to share about how we use these iPoems. But if you haven't been, putting yourself in the chat yet to ask questions or to contribute, please feel free. So in terms of summing up why we use iPoems, particularly in looking at this group of reentry supporters, there's something that captures attention, we believe, that when you're allowed to hear more of the natural language of participants. So traditionally in the qualitative research that I have written in the past, I try to give good juicy quotes, often extended quotes, sometimes dialogues, but it's not the same as allowing readers to have access to more of the sort of self-directed language from participants. So that's one of the reasons that we really like iPoems. I also really enjoy trying to find ways to get people to listen to people they would not otherwise, or that they have a snap judgment to, but then maybe willing to listen more. So in the class that Jess just concluded with us on sex crimes and punishments, I have used iPoems to hear from family members of people in the registry for many years. And I find that it does some work towards that kind of destigmatizing. And I also feel in most of the things that I try to do, whether in research or teaching or community events, I want to be aware of the lack of autonomy of the people who are contributing to my career and my success and advancement, right? So community groups and members of communities, and I know it's true here where we are in Delaware and elsewhere, are often rightfully resentful towards academics because we use them. And that using is the continuation of the same kinds of exploitation that they've experienced from the state and from others in a variety of ways. And it reinforces the kinds of things that we ideologically don't believe in. So I think the more we can find ways that we can partner with folks in larger ways, in larger projects as we're able to do that, but even in ways that sort of provide a little bit more of that autonomy back, it makes a difference. At least I like to think that it does. And I also feel that reentry supporters, the group that we're talking about, not those again who are officially probation and parole or otherwise in state roles, are kind of underseen, underviewed, underrecognized. And beyond that, I don't think they're often asked about how they do that work, how they negotiate the legal obstacles that they are negotiating, and how they persist. So our ongoing research is using a variety of methods to investigate these opportunities and pitfalls. I don't know what I did with the slide as I was moving things around that talked about how many interviews we've completed so far, but I think we're up to like 67. We've talked to over 50 folks who are reentry supporters, and our current wave of data collection is focusing on people on the registry who have left prison and are trying to reenter. We've done about 12 of those so far. And for me, it's been really important to be able to engage with that data in different kinds of ways, because doing the interviews is hard. It's depressing and challenging. And it's wonderful to have a partner like Maggie to do those interviews with me. I think we're able to kind of pick up for each other when one of us is struggling to figure out how to build rapport with someone, a variety of kinds of things. I think that collaboration is helpful. But then it's also helpful to be able to use our data and approach our analysis through a variety of methods. All right.
I'm very excited about this slide. So iPoems work as a standalone event, as components to an event, or as well as like a module or a component of a class. So as Chrysanthi was just saying, it's been really great to be able to co-host campus events with local advocates and really collaborate with local advocates. Earlier, Chrysanthi put the link to the entire PowerPoint. So if you want to click on any of these links, you can reach them through the PowerPoint, which is in the chat, and we can put it there again in case anybody arrives late. But in spring 2022, we hosted an event with the criminal justice activist David Garlock, as well as with Corey Priest, a local, he's in Delaware, and we sort of were able to collaborate with both of them. They were able to share some poetry. They each gave a short talk. David talks at a lot of events, so he has a whole spiel. So he did a shortened version of that. And then students got to ask questions. We had a pre-planned Q&A. And then we also read some poetry from our project in order to highlight some other voices that weren't totally represented. So we didn't have any women speakers at this event. It happened to be 2 men. So we read some poems that captured the experiences of women who are also reentry workers. We also, Chrysanthi has developed a template for working with students to create I-poems from publicly available documents like oral archives. So this template works for doing an I-poem activity with an undergraduate class or in a graduate class, where students are able to make decisions about what lines to pull, how to structure their poem. That was the activity that Jess engaged with in the Sex, Crimes, and Punishment capstone class. I-poems can also be the basis for course assignments. So aside from just being an activity to do in class, they can be add-ons to or alternatives to standard essays. So students can, in addition to writing the poem and crafting the poem, students can also write about how they made decisions about what to focus on, when they chose to make edits for clarity and why, and how the poem connects to course themes and other traditional literature that might reveal the same themes that are evident in a poem. Lastly, there's many forms of found poetry and poetic engagement. There's some fantastic literature out there and books on poetry as social justice and poetry as social justice in the classroom and in higher education spaces. So one option is to create blackout poetry. One other activity we did recently is students had a bunch of these policies from these reentry programs that sometimes have really, really rigid rules, especially the religious ones tend to have some really rigid rules about what people can and can't do while they're in the program, both on program property and outside in their daily lives if they want to be participants. So students, we gave them these documents and they could sort of black out certain lines. And when you do blackout poetry, the whatever words and phrases you don't basically cover with Sharpie, it becomes the poem. So students were able to do that. And there's also, you can create found poetry from text in a more free-form way that doesn't adhere to an I poem or we poem structure, where different statements and phrases that resonate can be pulled from the text in order to convey a certain theme.
Thank you. So this is another example of a poem that a student in our capstone class put together, Maria, and she gave us permission to share this here. She took 2 different transcripts from people who were talking about the programs that they worked within. And as she was reading them, she noticed how differently they talked about their work. And so she decided to create a multi-voice poem, which selected those kinds of things and put them next to each other. And I just thought it was a cool alternative or variation on what we had been talking about. So I see there's a question in the chat about how we integrate it into classes. So Maggie talked a little bit in the previous slide about how it works. In terms of how I make it fit within a course, there's a couple of different ways to do it. So if I feel like I have enough time, given the other stuff I have to do in a class, I think it works best to give it more than one class session. I also find that I'm tired by the end of the semester, and it's helpful for me to do something different by the end. And so I have done this in large classes of up to 60 people. That's large for the stuff I've taught recently. I realize some people have much larger classes, but I've taught them within large classes where I have the students accustomed to doing work in groups within class, as well as in the smaller kinds of capstone settings. And so what we did this previous time is that I presented a little bit about what the data was that they were going to be looking at at the end of a class. So after we talked about what was assigned for that day, I said, here's this thing that's part of research I'm doing. Because another one of my agendas, frankly, is to get undergraduates excited about research and to think of themselves as having the capacity to do it. Sometimes research, especially academic or scholarly research, seems like something that is beyond. And, you know, it's more fun, I think, to work in teams and to work collaboratively. And I think it's a part of our role as faculty is to sort of invite people into what we are doing and invite them to think about whether it's something they want to do as well. So in this instance, I talked a little bit about the research and then gave some instructions online, but we spent the class time doing the work of pulling from the transcripts. And I think that's important because it allowed the students and groups to talk to each other. We could hear from Jess maybe about how she felt that worked. She and her group created some really cool stuff. And then we had enough time that Maggie was actually able to do an additional class session in which she talked about other forms of poetic inquiry. And she talked about the Black Hat poetry and the other kinds of things she did. So if you can do it, a multi-class session works, but it's also possible to just get someone started, I would say, in a 20 to 30-minute session. I've done that in classes as well when I've been really, cramped in terms of the time that I had available for doing something like this. I've just sort of briefly introduced what we're doing, said, here's what you need to do, see how far you can get. And even just that little bit of introduction to it, I think has been helpful for students. So I hope that answers your question. Happy to talk more about that or anything else.
Awesome.
Jess,
Thank you.
I'm sure. Jess, can I put you on the spot and ask you what it was like to do this in class?
I mean, I thought it was a really good experience. My group, we picked one of the denser transcripts, so there was a lot of material to work with. I did like the fact that we were able to work on it in class and outside of class, just because we did have a really dense text. So we started it in class, and because we were collaborating, it took longer. And then when we had our individual assignments, we were able to delve deeper, and I went much farther in terms of just like how the text proceeded. Like, I think in class we only got up to like the 10th page, but then when I was doing it my own for the assignment, I looked through the entire transcript and was selective about what I was including for, poetic reasons, or just if I was trying to convey a certain idea. So it was like a little taste, a little introduction in class, and then you were able to carry that through to the assignment. So if this was like, the last assignment we did, or like an assignment that was worth like a larger grade than just, a small in class assignment, I think it's a good like transition.
Yeah, thank you. And I will say, some people hate poetry. Some people do not want to do this. And I respect that. I don't know, I'm always been the kind of person that wants to know in advance what's expected of me and know how to do it right. So I empathize with our students when they're placed in situations where we're kind of pushing them outside those expectations. So I do my best to always offer alternatives. So what Jess and Maggie and I have been talking about were in-class participation grades, very low stakes, like barely any points at all. But then for the essays that are due periodically over the course of the class, I added in an option to delve more deeply and to do more with the I poems. So no one was required to do that as their only way to fulfill an assignment, but it was an additional option that was available. So I think I saw another follow-up around this.
Someone said, do you teach methods?
So I teach, I have taught some advanced methods workshops, like some multi-day workshops, but I don't get to teach the methods courses in my department. So sadly, no. But I feel like research methods are a part of what I love. And so I do try to incorporate them in the courses I teach, even if they're not explicitly on methods. Yeah, let's see.
Wonderful. So, so first of all, thank you for that wonderful talk. So everyone, please join me in offering a virtual round of applause. So yay. So we have more time for questions. And as a reminder, we are recording. So if you don't want to be on camera, please feel free to post your question in the chat and I'll read it, or feel free to use your virtual hand or put your name in the chat, and either I or Santhi and Maggie can call on you. So please feel free to jump in. And if no one does, I have so many thoughts and comments. So I love this. This was super refreshing. I'm like, there's so many things that you touched on that I'm like, ooh, let's have a big discussion about that. So I will just give you my, I think that's like 6 things that I was like, oh, that's really exciting. That's really exciting. That's really exciting. And some of them are kind of peripheral and that you like mentioned in passing. And some are kind of more kind of in the middle. And so if anyone wants to jump in and kind of talk more about these things, that's great. And if Santhi and Maggie, you want to kind of use this as a prompt to say more about these things, please feel free, but don't feel obligated. So first of all, I kind of going in order through your talk. I was really excited to see and hear about how other scholars are dealing with the trauma and burnout of doing this type of research. And I'm really glad that we're talking about this and doing more of this kind of discourse in the field. We're like very slowly starting to talk about the difficulty of, doing interviews and being across the table from somebody telling you horrific things that have happened to them, or sometimes that they've done, or that they've experienced or seen, and just all the different relationships that people have with trauma, and then that secondary trauma or tertiary trauma in some cases. So that I'm really happy that you guys are talking about that and showing us a really constructive way of dealing with that. So just kudos. Really excited to see and hear more about that. I also really appreciated your caveat about the person first language and acknowledging the cumbersomeness, because that's, for me, that's something that I'm really I struggle with. It's like really like there are shorter ways, like as you said, there are a couple of different ways to refer to people. And so like for me, at least personally, I'm in this situation of I want to be as respectful as possible, but at the same time, like we have word counts and like I usually go over those word counts. And so I'm looking for every word I can cut. And, this is one of those things where every time I do it, or it gets repetitive to use the same, like somehow one word the same over and over again is fine, but like a phrase over and over again really feels repetitive. So mixing it up, going back and forth in my research, incarcerated person versus prisoner. I don't tend to use inmate, for example, but like, person who is incarcerated, I don't do that just because it is so cumbersome. So I appreciated you acknowledging that. I kind of want to, this is something I was thinking of having a whole workshop on, is having people talk about different takes on this, because for me, it's also very conflictual, because not everybody wants to be, the people that we're trying to protect don't necessarily want our protection.
Right.
So like, that's really complicated. So I appreciated you kind of, starting that conversation about the complexity around this. I'm also really excited to see you incorporating these creative methods, like creative and like this is part of a growing diversity of methods that are beyond our very basic kind of old-fashioned methods of interview, ethnography, text-based research and all of that. So it's really nice to see kind of fleshing out of these interesting ways of doing research. And I'm thinking about like Fergus McNeil's work, where he's co-creating and performing songs, kind of bringing joy, but also kind of working through pain, incorporating the people that he's studying. So it's not this necessarily hierarchical, but more horizontal relationship. Reuben Miller in his great book, using this written analysis of songs to help tell the story of his research and kind of playing with different types of literary styles. Like, this is so exciting. And of course, all of these things make the work more accessible to a broader audience and lets you reach a broader audience. And this is another method for doing that. And I really appreciate it. And the outreach that you guys are doing as part of this, that's really cool. I also love that this can work as a class assignment. I've been struggling during the pandemic of like, okay, so how do we create other types of assignments for students? And it was like, okay, so you can make a, what is that? Those like picture-based infographic, that's what it's called, an infographic. But like, it was really intimidating to students. And it feels like this could actually be more accessible, because when you're doing poetry, there is no right answer. And a lot of times that's one of the things that students struggle with is, well, am I doing the right thing? And it's poetry. There is no right thing. It's whatever it means to you. And so I really appreciate that. So I'm going to try this in my classes. And then finally, like a really big topic, or actually, sorry, two, not penultimately, really big topic. I really appreciate you talking about the secondary stigma around studying people on the registry, and especially so not just the pushback for people who are assisting people on the registry or people on the registry themselves, but even for researchers. Like, we're seeing that, especially these days in this highly polarized and politicized environment where, people studying people on the registry and trying to like, humanize them and work with the stigma, and even for just practical reasons, putting aside ideological reasons, like practical reasons, stigmatizing people doesn't help. Like, we know this, it's not a useful way for crime control. So even just kind of thinking of this from a conservative point of view of, let's, prevent crime, that's not great. So kind of thinking about the stigma. And so I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on that. And then finally, of course, I was happy to hear you talk about the extractive relationship of research and kind of thinking about alternative relationship structures. We're seeing so much of that lately. And I mean, even again, kind of putting aside ideological issues, there's also just the practical issues of, at a certain point, people won't want to talk to us. And so thinking through our responsibility kind of ethically as human beings, but also kind of our responsibility to future researchers who also need to have access to research. So those are all the things that were swimming around in my head while you guys were talking. So if any of that is something you want to talk more about, please feel free. There's not really a question in there. It's just more like these were really exciting things, but all of it was really exciting. So thank you so much for that wonderful talk, and I'll just turn it back to you.
Thank you, Ashley. That's so nice. I made a lot of notes. I think we have a lot to talk about going forward, perhaps not in this session, maybe in future ones. But let me ask Maggie, is there anything that you want to respond to from where we've been going?
I think I'm good right now. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I actually can, I think, kind of quickly march through what you shared, Ashley, if we have time. So first, talking about how we need to acknowledge burnout in research. I think the further I go in my career, the more responsibility I recognize I have towards the others I work with. And again, I have to thank Maggie, because she gave me this book, Trauma Stewardship, and kept asking me if I'd read it until I read it, or at least read it. And that has been really helpful. So that's what I would recommend to anybody. I will send you a copy of Trauma Stewardship if you don't have it yet, because it's really helpful. I don't, other than that, I don't have great answers. I think actually perhaps as a CRN or maybe as a broader professional association, we need to be working on this. I will point to some neat things that others have done. The ACE Center at George Mason, they just took a field trip with their research team on their way to ASC, and they stopped at a number of important historical and civil rights locations, and they shared meals with folks, and they made their way deliberately and carefully to the conference. And I think that kind of community building and recognition of what our work is grounded in is really cool. So I certainly don't have the funds to do that, because I don't belong to a big research center. And so I recognize that the fewer resources we have, the different the possibilities are. But I see there's a hand, so let me take a hand before I say further.
You're muted. Thanks.
Sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, and can you tell me how to
Okay.
say your name?
Esmery.
Esmery, great, thank you.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. That was a really excellent presentation, and I'm all for pushing methods beyond what we're accustomed to. Just because I think we're including more and more voices in the conversation, and I think they're automatically would indicate this. I'm also fascinated by your discussion around burnout, though, and I'm going to ask a question that might seem like an obvious one. But so I'm always tired anyway. How do you recognize burnout? How do I know that this is a different kind of feeling than the feelings I usually have struggle with fatigue?
That is really good. Maggie, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I think that is an especially difficult question. I'm not saying this is you. I have no idea if this is you, but for people who have like chronic illnesses and like chronic fatigue, that it's hard to tell the difference between what is regular, like just life, and what is burnout that might be specifically related to an occupation or a caregiving role. I can recommend a few books to you. First, Trauma Stewardship, I would say, is a must read. Like I've reread it. I think I might have read it 3 times. I read it roughly once a year at this point. Honestly. And it's not super jargony or like it's academic, but it's meant to be a handbook. I think the subtitle is like a guide or a handbook too. So they go through, I think, 16 signs of, they call it trauma exposure response. It's basically synonymous with vicarious trauma in many ways. So basically 15 or 16 signs of trauma exposure response. The other thing I like about that book is that it goes beyond the folks who work within the system. So a lot of definitions of vicarious trauma focus on law enforcement or people who do victim services work within a nonprofit hierarchy or within a government agency. But this book talks about people who do activism that's slightly more on the fringe of outside of government institutions or large nonprofits. And they also take a really broad approach to, they talk about how like biologists experience secondary trauma as they witness and study like mass extinctions of species. So although that might not be especially relevant for the folks in this room, I would definitely recommend that book. There's another one that I'm blanking on the full title of, but if you
Well,
give
let me read the list of warning signs that Liz
Yeah.
and Burke offer while you're looking at that. So I agree with you though, Esmery. Like, how do we tell? Because we're all so drained from so much that's gone on in the last 3 to 4 years. But what they identify as specifically likely to be attached to the work or the other kinds of trauma exposure are anger and cynicism. I definitely feel that. I could go down this list and say I feel all of them, so I won't do that. Anger, cynicism, avoidance, diminished creativity, exhaustion, fear, grandiosity. That's been the hard one for me to acknowledge in myself. But I recognize, so another thing I do is I teach in our women's prison, I teach courses for incarcerated students. And I began to feel like, oh, I have to do this. If I don't do this, nobody else is going to do it. If I fuck it up, it'll have all these terrible consequences for people. And I'm not that important. And so sort of being able to let that go and recognize my own sort of inflation of self as a symptom of burnout was really revelatory for me. Guilty feelings, hopelessness, hypervigilance, inability to embrace complexity, minimizing sense of persecution. So those are some of the warning signs. And again, they overlap with lots of other things we're experiencing societally related to the pandemic and our emerging recognition of racial violence and structural inequalities. So yeah, but I think the benefit of talking about something that relates to what we do for our work is that then we can talk about it in our workplace, and we can talk about it with our colleagues and our supervisors in ways that hopefully will build in some structural release points, hopefully. And do I have great ideas about how to do that as an academic right now? Not really. But I do think that that's the benefit of looking at things sociologically, is then we can look for the sociological intervention points.
And I think paying attention to when you feel burnt out too, or like when you feel these tired and fatigued, like, are the thoughts about whatever your work is that's stressing you out? Or, when are those feelings of burnout, like especially coming up? Because as we've talked about, like burnout, that can happen to anyone, regardless of like whether or not your job involves interacting with trauma and violence. Vicarious trauma and trauma exposure response is especially for those folks who are interacting with suffering, violence, trauma, including a broad definition of violence and trauma happening to our planet. But I put 2 books in the chat. I put the Trauma Stewardship's full title.
Thank you.
As well as this book, Burnout, that was actually, I'm also a victim advocate on campus. This book was co-authored and one of the authors was a victim advocate for the same group that I have been with for 3 years now. So I'm especially biased in that is like one of our sexual offense support alum, but that book is also pretty popular and gained some notoriety and is similarly designed to be, it's academic and it's empirically backed, but it's also designed to be sort of a hand guide and help somebody envision how to sort of address the burnout within themselves.
Wonderful. Are there other questions?
I did want to say, in response to one of the other things, Ashley, that you brought up about the secondary stigma that we can experience as people who are doing this work, and the vulnerability that we face in talking out about issues that are unpopular. Interestingly, I've never been shouted down talking about people in the sex offender registry. I have been shouted down talking about people in street-based sex work. So I think that's interesting, like what tends to draw attention. But I also recognize that I'm really protected by my privilege as a white cisgender woman. And so we have to mention Alan Walker and the experience that they have had doing their research in criminology on minor attracted people. And it seems pretty clear that their identity was a key part of their vulnerability, and the fact that they were on the tenure track. I'm also very, very fortunate to have tenure and to be in a place that knew what I did before I got here, so they were sort of ready for it. But even I feel like, well, am I going to get that next promotion, or is the president of the university going to say, ew, we don't want to be associated with that? Yeah. I think what we have to do as a professional group is figure out how we're going to protect the more vulnerable members of our group. And I feel badly that we didn't like band together and figure out what we were going to do when Alan was particularly under attack. I hope we can do better with the next one. And I'm not really sure yet what we should be doing, but I think that's something we need to keep talking about.
Yeah, that's a great point. And for what it's worth, because this is a CRN talk, If someone's a member of the CRN and they're in trouble, like let us know, because we're a big group. We're the biggest subsection or CRN of Law and Society, and then Law and Society is a big group. And while there are limitations of what Law and Society can do, especially for its status, tax exempt, all that stuff, organization, there are limits of what they're able to do, and then politically getting members to agree. But as a CRN, we can support our members, and so certainly if that happens, like do let us know, because that's something we can help out with, and we can protect each other.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? We can have a bigger discussion, definitely. It's also the end of the semester or quarter for folks. So I think everyone's exhausted.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So last call for questions or comments. Okay. So thank you. So everyone, please join me in thanking Santhi and Maggie for a great talk. Very stimulating. So many big issues going on. So virtual round of applause. Yay. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording if I can remember how to do it. Where is the recording? There we go.